The morning of my divorce trial, my husband walked into the courtroom wearing the same confident smile he'd worn the day his company landed its first $1 million contract. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward me, adjusted the cuff of his expensive navy suit, and leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "By lunch," he whispered, "you'll be walking out of here with nothing." Behind him, sitting comfortably in the second row, was the woman he'd insisted for nearly a year was just a colleague. She crossed one leg over the other, smiled at me without the slightest hint of shame, and said loud enough for nearby people to hear, she never built anything. She just happened to marry the right man. Several people turned to look at me, expecting tears, anger, some desperate attempt to defend myself. I gave them nothing. I simply reached into my briefcase and removed a thin brown envelope. Sliding it across the table toward my attorney, I spoke quietly. "When they finish speaking, give this to the judge." She looked down at the envelope, then back at me. "Are you sure?" I nodded. I've never been more sure of anything. 7 minutes later, the judge stopped reading halfway through the second page. His eyebrows slowly lifted. He looked from the documents to my husband, then back to the documents again. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear someone coughing in the hallway outside. Finally, the judge folded his hands together. "Mr. Walker," he said calmly, "I believe you've made a very serious mistake." My husband's smile disappeared. His attorney immediately leaned toward him. The woman sitting behind him stopped smirking. No one knew exactly what the judge had just read. But I did. Because I had spent nearly 15 years making sure every promise, every sacrifice, every dollar, and every lie had been documented. My name is Emma Brooks. I'm 39 years old. And the biggest mistake my husband ever made wasn't cheating on me. It was believing I hadn't been paying attention. But none of this began inside that courtroom. It began 15 years earlier, when we were both too young to realize that love isn't measured by promises. It's measured by what people do when no one is watching. I met Daniel Walker on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Neither of us was looking for a relationship. I had just finished graduate school and accepted a position as a financial analyst at a regional investment firm in Denver. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and after years of balancing classes with part-time jobs, stability sounded wonderful. Daniel was different. He had an engineering degree, a notebook filled with sketches, and enough confidence to convince anyone he was only one opportunity away from changing the world. He smiled constantly. He talked with his hands. And every conversation somehow ended with another business idea. Our first date lasted almost 5 hours. Not because we planned it that way. We simply kept talking about childhood dreams, about careers, about traveling, about the lives we imagined having someday. Near the end of dinner, he laughed and admitted something. "I probably shouldn't tell you this on a first date." "What?" "I want to quit my job." I nearly laughed. "You hate it that much?" "I don't hate engineering." He shook his head. "I hate building other people's dreams." Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a worn notebook. Inside were pages of handwritten ideas, business plans, marketing sketches, equipment lists, and financial projections. "I want my own consulting company." His eyes lit up in a way I'd never seen before. "I know it'll take years. I know most businesses fail. I know everyone thinks it's a terrible idea." He smiled, "But I can't stop thinking about it." I remember closing the notebook and handing it back to him. "You should do it." He stared at me. "Really? If you've planned this much already," I smiled, "then you've already started." Years later, I'd think about that conversation more times than I could count, because those 4 words changed both of our lives. Shh. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony surrounded by family and close friends. There were no extravagant decorations, no luxury venue, no expensive honeymoon. Instead, we put nearly every dollar we received into a separate savings account labeled simply Walker Engineering Fund. Daniel kissed me after we deposited the checks. "This," he said, tapping the bank receipt, "is the beginning." I believed him, every single word. A year later, he resigned from his job. His company officially existed, at least on paper. Reality looked very different. Our first office wasn't really an office. It was a tiny room above an old hardware store with stained carpet, flickering fluorescent lights, and furniture purchased from estate sales. The desk wobbled, the printer jammed every third page. The air conditioner worked only when someone kicked the side of the unit. Daniel called it perfect. I called it temporary. Neither of us cared. We believed hard work would solve everything. The first year nearly destroyed us. Clients canceled projects. Invoices went unpaid. One supplier demanded immediate payment or threatened legal action. There were weeks when Daniel came home convinced he'd made the worst decision of his life. One evening, I found him sitting alone in the dark kitchen. His laptop was open. Spread across the table were unpaid bills, payroll estimates, tax notices. He didn't hear me walk in. "I think I'm finished," he whispered. I poured 2 cups of coffee before sitting beside him. "No." He rubbed both hands across his face. "We've lost another contract. We can't keep doing this." "You can." He looked exhausted. "You don't understand." "No," I replied softly. "You don't understand." I reached into my purse and slid an envelope toward him. Inside was a cashier's check. His eyes widened. "Emma?" "I moved some money." "From where?" "My savings." His face immediately changed. "No, it'll keep payroll covered." "I can't take this." "You aren't taking it." I smiled. "We're investing in our future." He stared at me for nearly a minute before quietly wiping tears from his eyes. "I swear." His voice cracked. "One day I'll make this worth every sacrifice." "I know you will." He stood up and wrapped both arms around me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I couldn't do this without you." Those words became almost routine over the next several years. Whenever another obstacle appeared, whenever another loan was approved, whenever another client signed, Daniel always found my hand. This company belongs to both of us. I believed him every single time, because why wouldn't I? Marriage isn't supposed to keep score. It's supposed to build together. So I worked overtime, accepted every extra assignment, skipped vacations, postponed buying a newer car, delayed the MBA I dreamed about since college. Whenever someone asked why I was working so much, I always gave the same answer. We're building something. What they didn't know was that most months my paycheck covered almost everything. Mortgage, utilities, insurance, groceries, business software, office rent, sometimes even payroll when a client paid late. I never complained. Because every time I looked across the dinner table, Daniel would smile and remind me, when this company finally succeeds, everything we have will belong to both of us. And for a long time, I truly believed that future was getting closer. I just didn't realize that success has a way of revealing parts of people that failure never does. The man who promised we'd share everything was about to meet something far more dangerous than bankruptcy. He was about to meet success, and neither of us knew it would change him forever. People love saying, money changes people. I don't think that's completely true. Money doesn't create someone's character. It simply gives them the freedom to show you who they've been all along. For almost 7 years, Daniel fought for every contract that came through the door. Some months, we celebrated landing a project worth $20,000 as if we'd won the lottery. Then everything changed. It started with a single government infrastructure contract. The project was bigger than anything Daniel's company had ever handled. When it finished ahead of schedule, another contract followed. Then another. Within 18 months, Walker Engineering wasn't a struggling startup anymore. It had offices in 3 states, more than 100 employees, magazine interviews, industry awards, business podcasts, television appearances. Everywhere we went, someone recognized Daniel. People called him a visionary, a self-made entrepreneur, a genius who had built an empire from nothing. Every time I heard those words, a tiny part of me wanted to correct them, not because I wanted recognition, but because from nothing wasn't true. He had started with my savings, my paycheck, my sacrifices. Then I would remind myself, we were married. His success was our success. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But the first change was almost too small to notice. Daniel stopped asking about my day. Dinner used to last an hour. We'd laugh, tell stories, and make plans for the future. Now he spent most meals staring at his phone between bites. Another email? I'd ask. He'd barely look up. Just work. At first, I understood. Growing companies demanded attention. I never complained, but weeks became months. Conversations disappeared. If I talked about my job, he nodded without really listening. If I mentioned my family, he answered with one-word replies. Eventually, dinner became two people sitting at the same table, living completely different lives. Then came the business trips. At first, they made sense. Chicago, Dallas, Seattle, clients, investors, conferences. But gradually, something felt different. The trips became longer. The explanations became shorter. Sometimes he'd leave on Friday morning and return late Sunday night. When I'd ask how the conference went, he'd answer without details. It was good. Productive. Busy. Then he'd change the subject. One evening, I suggested we take a weekend vacation together. Nothing expensive, just somewhere quiet. A lake, a cabin, anywhere without emails. Daniel didn't even look up from his laptop. I don't have time. You've been saying that for almost a year. I'm building something. I smiled gently. We already built it. He finally looked at me. No, we're just getting started. There was something different in his voice, not excitement, impatience, as though anything that slowed him down, including me, had become an inconvenience. A month later, I brought up something I'd postponed for nearly a decade. My company is offering tuition assistance. Daniel kept typing. For what? My MBA? He stopped for only a second before continuing. Why? The question caught me completely off guard. What do you mean, why? You already have a good job? I've always wanted to finish it. You don't need another degree. I laughed awkwardly. I've wanted this since before we met. He shrugged. Seems unnecessary now. Unnecessary. That single word stayed with me for days. Not because he disagreed, but because he never asked why it mattered to me. For years, I'd put my dreams on hold for ours. Now mine seemed to have no place in his future. The first real crack appeared by accident. Every month, I helped organize household paperwork before sending documents to our accountant. Old habits die hard. Even though Daniel hired accountants for the company years ago, I still handled our personal finances. One afternoon, I was sorting through receipts when I found a hotel invoice tucked inside a folder. Luxury Harbor Suites. 3 nights. Penthouse level. The dates looked familiar. I opened Daniel's calendar on our shared computer. Those same dates showed he had attended an engineering conference in Phoenix. The problem was, the hotel receipt wasn't from Phoenix. It was from San Diego, nearly 400 miles away. I stared at it for several minutes. Maybe the conference changed locations. Maybe he met a client afterward. There had to be an explanation. When Daniel came home that evening, I held up the receipt. I found this while organizing paperwork. He glanced at it for less than 2 seconds. Oh, what was the San Diego trip? He didn't hesitate. Client meeting. I thought you were in Phoenix. I was. So why the hotel? He loosened his tie. The client wanted to meet afterward. Who? He frowned. Emma. What? Do I really need to explain every business meeting? The conversation ended there, not because I believed him, but because I suddenly realized how defensive he'd become. Years earlier, Daniel would have happily told me every detail. Now, asking a simple question made me feel like I was crossing a line. Little things began piling up. His phone suddenly required a password, then facial recognition. He started stepping outside whenever certain people called. Messages disappeared seconds after arriving. One evening, I walked into the living room just as he flipped his phone upside down. You startled me, he said. I smiled. I live here. He laughed. But it sounded forced. Our anniversary arrived in October. For 15 years, we'd celebrated together. Even during the hardest years, we'd found time. This year, Daniel called at 6 that evening. I'm sorry. I'll be late. Again? Big investor dinner. We had reservations. I know. We can celebrate next week. He hung up before I could answer. I ate dinner alone. The restaurant called twice asking whether we were still coming. I finally canceled the reservation. At 10:30 that night, I looked out the living room window. Daniel's car pulled into the driveway. He walked inside carrying no briefcase, no laptop, no work folders, just a shopping bag from a jewelry store I'd never seen before. He noticed me looking at it. Oh. He smiled awkwardly. Client gift. Then he walked upstairs. Something inside me whispered, he's lying. I hated that voice, because once you hear it, you start noticing everything. 3 weeks later, I received an email that wasn't meant for me. The sender immediately recalled it, but not before I'd opened the attachment. It was an invoice, not for a hotel, not for a restaurant, for a luxury penthouse apartment downtown. 12-month lease, fully furnished, monthly payment higher than the mortgage on our own house. The tenant's name wasn't listed, only the company's corporate account. That evening, I asked Daniel about it. I saw an apartment lease. He didn't seem surprised. Oh, it's for entertaining clients. 12 months? It makes financial sense. You've never mentioned it. I didn't think I needed to. Again, the conversation ended. But this time, I didn't feel confused. I felt something much worse. Alone. I told myself I was imagining things, that stress was making me suspicious, that successful businesses demanded sacrifices. Then one rainy Thursday, I came home nearly 2 hours earlier than usual after a power outage closed our office. Daniel's car was already in the driveway. Strange. He'd told me he had meetings all afternoon. The house was unusually quiet. I set my purse on the hallway table and walked toward his home office. The door was almost closed. I was about to knock when I heard his voice. He wasn't alone. He was on speakerphone. And the next sentence I heard stopped me so completely. I forgot how to breathe. "I've already spoken to my attorney," Daniel said calmly. "Once the divorce is finalized, she'll walk away with almost nothing." I stood frozen outside the door, afraid to move, afraid to make a sound. Because for the first time in 15 years, I realized my husband wasn't planning our future anymore. He was planning my exit. I stood outside Daniel's office, frozen. "I've already spoken to my attorney," he said. "Once the divorce is finalized, she'll leave with almost nothing." Another voice asked, "And the company?" Daniel laughed. "It's protected. I've been moving everything for months." I quietly stepped away before he could see me. That night, I didn't confront him. If he'd planned this for months, every answer he gave me would already be a lie. The next morning, I called divorce attorney Sarah Whitmore. She listened to everything, then asked one question. "Do you keep financial records?" I smiled. "I keep everything." The following day, I arrived at her office with 3 storage boxes. Inside were 15 years of bank statements, receipts, payroll records, tax returns, loan documents, and emails. Sarah flipped through the folders in silence. Finally, she looked at me and said, "Your husband thinks he built this company alone." She picked up another file. "He's about to learn that paper remembers everything." Then we found something neither of us expected. An old email from Daniel himself. It read, "Without your money and your sacrifices, this company wouldn't exist. Everything we're building belongs to both of us." Sarah looked at me and smiled. "I don't think we're preparing a defense anymore. We're preparing the truth." And buried inside one final forgotten folder was a document Daniel had completely forgotten he ever signed. The divorce hearing began exactly as Daniel expected. His attorney confidently told the judge, "Mr. Walker built this company through his own hard work. Mrs. Brooks made no meaningful contribution." Sarah didn't argue. She simply handed the judge the sealed envelope. Inside was a timeline of 15 years of financial records, emails, and one forgotten document Daniel himself had signed. The judge read silently. Then he looked up. "Mr. Walker, I believe you've made a very serious mistake." Daniel's confidence vanished. The judge compared the documents with the company's financial records. Every payment Emma made, every loan she covered, every email where Daniel admitted she kept the business alive. Finally, the judge ordered a full forensic financial review before making any decision. For the first time that morning, Daniel wasn't smiling anymore. He finally realized the one thing he never planned for was that the truth had been documented all along. 3 weeks later, the courtroom filled once again. The forensic investigation was complete. The judge looked directly at Daniel. "The evidence confirms Mrs. Brooks played a major financial role in building this company." He turned another page. "It also confirms this court was not given the complete picture. The ruling was simple. The assets would be divided fairly based on the documented facts." Daniel had lost. After the hearing, he stopped me outside the courtroom. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I kept telling myself I built everything alone." I looked at him and smiled sadly. I never wanted revenge. I only wanted the truth. Then I walked away. A few months later, I opened my own financial consulting firm. For the first time, I wasn't helping someone else build a dream. I was building my own. Looking back, I didn't win because I received a fair settlement. I won because I finally realized my worth had never depended on someone else's recognition. Sometimes, the strongest evidence isn't what you say. It's what you've quietly protected all along.